Hello everyone, I am Arasan UTHAYASURIYAN, ESR2 of the No to Noise project. I'm basically based at Matelys Research Lab in France, and I have registered myself as a doctoral student at the University of Nottingham and as well as at ENTP in France. So today I'll be presenting about the advancements that I made in my PhD, and they are particularly focused on developing advanced vibro-acoustic condensed models to predict the acoustic responses of multi-layer structures. As a brief introduction, as Abhilash mentioned in the last presentation, by combining the layers of different materials, we could benefit from good performance on both structural and vibroacoustic fronts. To analyze these multi-layer structures, many types of vibroacoustic models are being used in the literature, and one such type is called equivalent or condensed plate models, which is the topic of my doctoral research. We will see what are these equivalent plate models and why do we use them basically, and what are the basic details that we should know to understand these models. What exactly do we get from them, and what is the process or methodology that we need to follow to get those properties. So that's the first part of my presentation, and after that I will move on to the 4 advancements that I made during the course of my PhD. Since many equivalent plate models and other vibroacoustic models use plate theories, the first part of my research would be focused on the applicability or validity limits of the commonly employed plate theories for vibroacoustic applications in general. Secondly, I have developed a simple equivalent plate model for 3-layer structures. The main idea, the advantage of this simple model would be reducing the implementation time and other challenges compared to the existing equivalent plate models. Then a new condensed model for thick multi-layers is developed because the existing condensed models are applicable only for the thin multi-layer structures. So as the existing models may not be suitable or suitable to apply due to ignoring some propagation modes, especially especially when the multi-layer is thick or has some soft or some porous layers. So therefore, a new condensed model is developed to extend the applicability range to many types of multi-layer structures by including all the major propagation modes in the structure. And finally, the new condensed model is implemented in the finite element framework to realize the benefit on the total computation time. So what are these equivalent plate models in the first place, and why do we use them? So to look at the answer to these questions, we could look at 2 important advantages that they provide. Let us look at the first one. We have seen that these multi-layer structures are based, so these multi-layer structures are primarily used to improve the structural and vibroacoustic performance. But when we go for finite element computations of these structures, we would need different mesh types to suitable for different materials that we use in the layered structures. Additionally, for an industrial problem like cabin flooring design of an aircraft, if we mesh each and every layer of these structures, it would result in larger number of degrees of freedom, which would require more computational time and power. Alternatively, if we could convert this multi-layer system into a single layer, which would exhibit the same or equivalent vibroacoustic response, we would end up with only one layer of material to handle, and this would help us in reducing the total computational time and power for the finite element simulation. This is one of the major benefit that we could realize from the equivalent plate model. All right, so now let's look at the another major advantage of these models. Depending on the type of layers that we use in the multi-layer structures, these kind of different waves could propagate inside the layer, which would then contribute to the global response of the structure. If the layers are too thin, we could observe that only bending and shear waves are contributing to the global response of the system. And generally, these two wave motions are categorized as symmetric wave types. On the other hand, if the multi-layer structure is thicker, which is the case for some practical applications, or if it has any soft materials or porous materials, then along with the bending and shear, compressional motion also would influence the response of the multi-layer structure. Now here, the equivalent plate models help us to understand the interaction between the symmetric motions, such as bending and shear. For example, at a given frequency, how the multi-layer structure is going to behave. Is it going to be controlled by the bending of all layers, or only some layers, or shear motion has an important role at what frequency, and how does this affect the damping nature of the structure? What are the interaction between the symmetric and anti-symmetric motions, and when are they going to be important? So this kind of information or understanding could be obtained from the equivalent plate models, and this information would be quite useful while designing the multi-layer system. So okay, so now to understand these models, we need to know a few fundamental information, and those are the vibrating or the propagating waves inside the structure, due to which the propagating waves inside the structure due to the vibration, which we have just seen actually. So, for example, if we consider a transmission problem across a wall, the wall would vibrate in this complex manner due to the sound source on the left side. If we break down this complex motion, we could find out that the bending, shear, and the compressional waves are fundamental waves that propagate inside these structures. There are different equivalent plate models in the literature, but they are mainly differing from each other by what are the propagating waves that they allow in each layer of the multi-layer system. Why are they allowing only few types of waves and not all? It is mainly due to reduce the complexity level of the theoretical formulation, and thereby targeting only specific problems or applications. So by formulating these equivalent plate models, what do we get as an output? Before that, we'll look at the three models that are widely used in industries. In the first model, called added stiffness model, only bending wave motion is considered in all the layers of the multi-layer system. And in another popular model called RKU, which was developed for three-layer systems, the outer layers are assumed to be controlled only by the bending, and the core layer is controlled by only shear. In the third model developed by Guyader, both bending and shear waves are allowed in all the layers of the multi-layer structure. All these models, what they do is that they convert the multi-layer structure into a single isotropic thin plate with a frequency-dependent bending stiffness or Young's modulus, and the frequency-dependent damping loss factor. And these material properties will be given as inputs for the finite element calculations, which I will show in the later part of this presentation. So we should note that these models exhibit only equivalent bending effect of the multi-layer structures, and mainly neither of these models include a compressional motion in their formulation. So knowing these basics of equivalent or the condensed plate models, now I move on to the advancements that are done to improve these models in my project. So the first one is to find the frequency limits of validity of commonly used plate theories for vibroacoustic applications. So two types of plate models are commonly used in many vibroacoustic theories, and those are Love-Kirchhoff and Reisner-Mindlin theories. So commonly these are referred as thin and thick plate theories respectively. So now if we plot a transmission loss curve for a concrete wall subjected to a plane wave incidence as shown here, we could see that the responses predicted by these plate theories deviate after certain frequencies when we compare these solutions against the reference solution computed by the elasticity theory or the transfer matrix method that Jnani talked about in his talk this morning. So the thin plate theory response basically deviates from this point onwards, as it does not include the shear effect. The thick plate theory deviates from this frequency as it ignores the dilatational motion. So finding these frequency limits of respective theories would be necessary to safely apply these theories. So, and in this line, many researchers have developed empirical relations to find the frequency of thin plate theory. But there are many, and most of them depend on the thickness of the plate or only geometrical parameter of the plate, which do not take into account the mechanical or material properties of the plate. So also, there is no clear-cut analytical expression available in the literature to safely apply this thin plate theory or plate theories in general. So, so in addition to my knowledge, there is no frequency limit expression available in the literature for the Reisner-Mindlin or thick plate theory. So as we have seen before, the equivalent plate models also use thin plate theory to condense the response of the multilayer structure, and therefore it would be very interesting to see the frequency limit of plate theories so that we would also get to know the limit of the existing plate theories or where we have to stop all this information. So to do this, here is the overview of the process that is followed to get those expressions. We know that in thin plate theory, only bending motion is considered, and therefore only bending wave is allowed to propagate inside the structure. On the other hand, the thick plate theory includes shear motion along with the bending motion. But we should also note that both of these theories do not include the compressional motion in their formulation. Okay, so now if I plot a dispersion curve of a plasterboard layer from thin and thick plate theories, we observe two important information here. The first one, we could see that the low frequency behavior is heavily controlled by the bending of the structure. And secondly, the high frequency behavior is controlled by the shear motion of the structure. Or in other words, the bending and shear wave numbers are low and high frequency asymptotes of the propagating wave number computed by the thick plate theory. So as the shear wave number is comparatively lower than the bending wave number in the low frequency range and increases linearly with the frequency, we could limit the thin plate theory by defining the ratio C between the bending and shear wave number as I have indicated here. This particular definition would help us to find this form of analytical expression for the frequency limit of thin plate theory, which includes both geometrical and mechanical parameters. For the frequency limit of thick plate theory, we could compare the propagation modes of the thick plate and the elastic solid. Note that the principles of elasticity includes the compressional motion of the structure along with the bending and shear, whereas the thick plate theory neglects the compressional motion. Now, using the approach followed by Dim and Long in 1970, we could compute the antisymmetric and symmetric impedances of a plate. Details on how to compute these impedances are not the main focus of this particular presentation, but it can be found in the paper that we published, which I have shown below. Similar to the process to the frequency limit of thin plate theory that we have seen before, we could also express a condition between the symmetric and antisymmetric admittances as shown here, which would help us to get the analytical expression for the frequency limit of thick plate theory. Note that many plate theories do not include the compressional motion in their formulation. So this means that the frequency limit shown here is not only applicable for Reissner-Mindlin theory, but also for many other plate theories in general. So now if we plot a transmission loss for a concrete layer with the mentioned properties, we could observe the well-predictive nature of the frequency limits that we compute, that are computed by the analytical expressions that I have shown before. Now, the second advancement is regarding the development of a simple equivalent plate model for 3-layer sandwich plates. Among the existing condensed plate models, Guyader and RKU models are widely popular due to their effectiveness to capture the natural response of the multilayer structures into a single layer. But one of the major challenges with regard to these models is the implementation process, as these models require many complex computations. Implementing and testing of these models would take considerable amount of time. In addition, the Guyader model requires solution tracking techniques to be implemented to find the physically propagating wave of the multilayer structure. So to avoid these complications, a simple model is developed for 3-layer structures from the observations, the physical nature observed by the Bhutan Vivage using homogenization approach. So to understand the methodology, let's go back a little and see the dispersion curve of a single layer again. We could see that the low frequency asymptote of the propagating wave number is the bending wave number, and that high frequency asymptote is of the shear wave number. This is what we have seen just few minutes before. On the other hand, if we see the nature of the propagating wave number for the sandwich structure, it seems like an S-shaped curve or sigmoid curve, and the asymptotical behavior looks different than the single layer structure. Now here, let me go a little deeper. I have taken the same sandwich configuration from the previous slide and plotted the propagating wave number computed from both Guyader and RKU models, and we could see that they seem to match perfectly well at all frequencies. At low frequencies, what we observe, the propagating wave number can be computed by the bending stiffness given by the added stiffness model, and this explains that all 3 layers of the 3-layer structure contribute to the low frequency response through the bending motion. At higher frequencies, it can be worked out to see that the contribution comes only from the skins or outer layers to estimate the wave number. From this plot, we could also observe that the transition zone is controlled by the shear of the core layer. And with all this information, we can, or a new developed model, a new simple model is developed, which is quite straightforward to use. And the parameters D low, D high, or transition frequency FT, R, all these could be easily calculated using simple analytical expressions. To validate this model, let me reconstruct the wave number as follows. At low frequency, an asymptote can be drawn from the bending contribution from all the layers, as I have mentioned before. At high frequency, an asymptote can be drawn from the bending contribution only from the skins of the sandwich. And the transition frequency can be computed from the shear modulus of the core layer. With all these 3 information, we could obtain a full frequency range response as shown here with the yellow colored curve, which is in high agreement with the Guyader model. the existing equivalent plate model. So therefore, this new model could provide us the following advantages over other existing models. Due to its simplicity, the new model will be easier for implementation compared to other models. Due to the same reason, it can act as a handy tool to optimize the sandwich layers to achieve the desired performance. And finally, it can be helpful to understand the physical behavior of this sandwich structure at different frequency regimes. So we have seen how equivalent plate models behave for the sandwich structures, but are these models sufficient to completely describe the vibro-acoustic behavior of any kind of multi-layer structures? Let's look at a case here. If a 3-layer sandwich made of plasterboard skins and glue as the core, we could note that up until the critical frequency, the transmission loss is well predicted by the equivalent plate models. But if we focus our attention to the high frequencies, we could observe the poor correspondence between the equivalent plate models and the response from the theory of elasticity or the TMM. And this is because the existing equivalent plate models do not include the compressional effect of the multi-layer structure in their formulation. So this particular point can also be supported by performing the Lamb wave analysis. Lamb waves are the elastic waves that propagate inside the structure, and these waves are considered to be accurate and complete as they arise from solving the complex elasticity equations. Here I have presented the zeroth order antisymmetric and symmetric Lamb wave solutions for both stiff and soft core configurations. Note that the antisymmetric wave corresponds to the bending and shear motion of the structure, as we have seen before, whereas the symmetric wave corresponds to the compressional or dilatational motion. As we could see from this plot, the Guyader model predicts the correct antisymmetric wave solution, but unable to predict the wave solution corresponding to the symmetric motion. This could particularly lead to erroneous results if the core is too soft, or because the compressional mode also contributes to the complete vibrating motion of the structure after a certain frequency. And therefore, we have developed a new condensed model, which includes the compressional motion along with the bending and the shear motions of the multi-layer structure. Now, let's see the methodology of this new condensed model, including the compressional motion along with the bending and shear motions would be normally tricky, but in the case of symmetric multi-layers, we could inspire the work done by Dim and Long, again from their work in 1970, where they demonstrated that we could decouple the symmetric admittance we could decouple the symmetric and antisymmetric nature of the whole structure, and we could express the behavior of these two decoupled plates separately. So for your understanding, I have just given the schematic representation of the symmetric and the antisymmetric modes here. For 1 minute, sorry. Yeah, so we would have from the demand lang the output or the approach followed by the demand lang, we could express the symmetric and antisymmetric modes of the structure, or we could compute the admittance or impedance of those two motions, and which is what we are going to see in the next slide. So for example, I have taken a 3-layer sandwich with the thicker soft core and steel skins. For this configuration, I have plotted the admittance curves at normal incidence, that is at theta equal to 0, and at an oblique incidence of theta equal to 60 degrees. A few important observations could be made from these plots, which would help us to express the properties of symmetric and antisymmetric condensed plates. At first, both incidences, so the first observation would be in both of these incidences, we could see a peak around maybe 150 or 200 hertz, which corresponds to the compressional frequency of the structure. And secondly, at 60-degree incidence, we could see a peak around 6,000 hertz, but we see this peak at both symmetric and anti-symmetric admittances. So that is an important observation which would help us. And this position of the position of this peak is indeed controlled by the bending stiffness of the structure. So the existing equivalent plate models express the impedance of an equivalent thin plate like this, but note that this kind of definition accounts only for the bending and shear of the multilayer structure and not for the compressional. In our present case, we have decoupled the equivalent thin plate into two different equivalent thin plates. And since both admittances have the same peak, which is controlled by the bending stiffness, we could keep this term common for both of these impedances. We also note that for different incidences, this shaded region is identical and it is controlled by the mass term of the impedance. Although the region is identical at different angles, the nature of symmetric and anti-symmetric admittances are different, as we could see from the plot. As you can see, the anti-symmetric admittance decreases with the frequency, whereas the symmetric admittance increases, have its peak around 200 hertz, and then decreases with the frequency. Therefore, two different mass terms are defined for each impedance, like I have shown here. So it may be also noted that at normal incidence, the entire region is actually controlled by the mass, as the contribution of the stiffness is 0 at normal incidence. So in generic symmetric multilayer structure configuration, we could express the impedances of these two decoupled equivalent plates as shown here, with the frequency dependent properties dEq, rho A and rho S. dEq is usually taken from any equivalent, any existing equivalent plate models, or a simple equivalent plate model that we have seen just a few minutes before, which was developed for a 3-layer structure. The frequency dependent rho A and rho S are computed from the normal incidence calculations, and details of obtaining these two equivalent properties can be found in the article that we published recently. And I'm not going to focus more on how to get these properties in this presentation. So we also should keep in mind that the three dynamic properties do not depend on the angle of incidence, and therefore they can be called as the intrinsic properties of the multilayer structure, which is quite powerful in computing the vibro-acoustic responses for many acoustic loads. So therefore, in the summary, the existing equivalent plate models require one dynamic property, which is dEq, while the newly newly developed condensed model requires three dynamic properties, dEq, rho A and rho S, to capture both antisymmetric and compressional motion of the multilayer structure. So note that we could find the equivalent Young's modulus EEC from the equivalent bending stiffness definition, which is denoted by dEq. So this equivalent Young's modulus would go as an input in the finite element calculations. To show the validity of these models, a sandwich structure with the steel skins and a soft core is taken and subjected to diffuse field excitation here. As a reference, the transmission loss computed from a full elasticity solution or the transfer matrix method is shown here in the yellow color curve. Note that we could observe two sudden drops in the TL from this curve, and these are from the resonance due to the compressional and the coincidence effect critical effect respectively. So if we could compute the TEL response using the Guyader model or any existing equivalent plate model, we get a response like this, and we could clearly see the deviated or erroneous response of the from this model after 100 Hertz. Though Guyader model predicts correct coincidence frequency or the critical frequency compared to the elasticity theory, it underestimates the TL response at this frequency. Further, we could clearly see that the Guyader model missed to predict the compressional frequency or the compressional frequency effect in the TL, as the Guyader model does not contain compressional motion in its formulation. Now, if we plot the response from the newly developed condensed model, we could see that it correctly captured the vibro-acoustic performance throughout the frequency range by including both symmetric and antisymmetric motions of the structure. Okay, so now it's time to implement this newly developed condensed model into the finite element framework to realize the benefits on the total computational time as we have seen in the initial part of the presentation. So we know that for a multi-layer system like this, we need to keep only the condensed layer with the dynamic properties EAC, rho A and rho S. So in our implementation, we modeled this condensed layer with thick plate elements instead of thin plate elements. Now you might ask, how can you model with thick plate elements while the condensed models are based on thin plate theory? Because if you remember, we used the thin plate impedances or the thin plate theory to get the dynamic properties of the condensed layer. So then why did we go with the thick plate elements instead of thin plate elements? Is what you might wonder. So the main challenge with the thin plate elements are they require some special shape functions which should offer the non-zero higher order derivatives. So this often leads to complex implementation process, and additionally, if we want to run the simulations for higher order elements, we would need another set of special shape functions which are even more complex. So therefore, to avoid this, we modeled the condensed layer with thick plate elements, which has two different parts in the stiffness matrix definition. We have a bending part Kb and a shear part Ks, and these element stiffness matrices can be easily obtained by the standard isoparametric shape functions formulation. So now if we introduce a penalty factor gamma on the shear part, we could observe an interesting point here. If I increase the value of the penalty factor, we could observe that the thick plate response is actually very much closer to the thin plate response, right? So we could exploit this interesting behavior of the thick plate elements to retrieve the same behaviors or the similar behaviors of the thin plate elements without going through all the hassles of implementing the special shape functions that we need for thin plates. So with this observation, we are now confident to use the thick plate elements with the penalty factor on the shear part to model the condensed layer. Note that in the finite element setup, this condensed layer would look like this. We have two air layers that surround the condensed layer. As we have seen before, the condensed layer is decoupled into two condensed layers correspond to antisymmetric and symmetric motions of the structure. You could see that the antisymmetric condensed plate elements are defined with the dynamic properties dAc and rho A, whereas the symmetric condensed plate elements are defined with dynamic properties dAc and rho S. So we will see the response of this finite element approach for two multilayer configurations. In the first configuration, the multilayer is a soft core bonded with the two plasterboard skins. If we compare the response of different FE approaches, we see that the proposed finite element scheme matches well with the conventional 3D finite element approach. If we focus our attention on the computation time, we see that the proposed condensed model, or the proposed condensed finite element approach runs 15 times faster than the conventional three-dimensional finite element. So this is one of this is the computational advantage that we get from the condensed model. Let's now look at the second configuration, where a double wall partition case is taken. In the typical double wall constructions, glass wool porous layer would be decoupled from the plasterboard skins with some air gap. Here I have given the air gap as 1.5 millimeter. So for this configuration as well, we could see that the proposed FE approach exhibit a good correspondence or good performance compared to the reference solutions. On the computational time, we see that the condensed FE scheme takes only 160. It takes 160 times lesser computation time than the conventional finite element approach, which is a significant benefit that we could get from the condensed models. So all right, so now we have reached the end of this presentation. So in summary, there are 4 advancements that I had done during my time with the Note to Noise project. At first, the frequency or validity limits of commonly used plate theories are obtained, and those are clear-cut analytical expressions which depend on the geometrical and mechanical properties of the single layer structures, while the other empirical relations in the literature mainly depend on the geometric parameters only. So these expressions would be quite useful to many vibro-acoustic models, including the equivalent plate models. Secondly, a new equivalent plate model is developed for 3-layer structure using the observations made from the homogenization approach by Bhutan and Vivej. The model is quite simpler than the other equivalent plate models, and therefore we could benefit from the quicker implementation time. Also, this model would be a handy tool to understand the physical behavior of the sandwich structures. Although the equivalent plate models are efficient to reduce the computational time and helpful to understand the physical behavior of the layered structures, they are mainly restricted to only the thin structures. Therefore, a new condensed model is developed which extends its applicability to wide range of thin and thick multilayer structures, and it can be applied to multilayers or sound packages with poroelastic layers as well. And finally, the new condensed model is implemented into the finite element framework to realize the benefits of the condensed model that they provide to the users. Out of the 4 different presented work, 3 work has been already published, and the one on the finite element implementation will be soon submitted to the journal. So that's all I have for this presentation, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer, and thanks a lot for your attention.